This summer, Gretchen and I are planning to celebrate our 30th wedding anniversary by taking a 100-kilometer hike through the Scottish and English countryside. And so we've been out here at T.L. Fuller Park just practicing, breaking in all of our gear. And as we've been walking, we've been thinking about the Apostle Paul and his travels. You know, he probably didn't have to drive to a park to practice walking. It's just what he did. Travel in those days was very different. He probably didn't have a Snoopy lunchbox or a great backpack. So what was it like for him to get from point A to point B? That's what we're going to be talking about in today's lesson. Hope you find it interesting. Welcome to week 3 of our study of the Apostle Paul, his theology and mission. Today we're going to start looking at the first missionary journey. So we've been talking about Paul for the first 2 weeks, and today we're actually going to start looking at the work that he did. Although this session will continue to be in that vein of introductory material, we're going to be looking at what it was like to travel in Paul's day. And then we're going to talk about the places that the first missionary team visited on that journey. And then we're going to move into the Bible study portion for the remainder of the week. But first, let's talk a little bit about what it was like to travel in the time of Paul. Over the course of his missionary travels, the Apostle Paul covered about 12,500 miles, and most of that was on foot. How was that possible? Well, by the grace of God and the foreknowledge of the Father, travel in the Mediterranean world was comparatively simple. Actually, it would have been as easy for Paul to travel as it was for Napoleon. So, because of the Pax Romana, people were able to travel quite well by land. Travel over long distances was possible on paved roads. It was relatively safe. About 130 years before the birth of Christ, the Romans began developing a network of roads between their colonies. One military route, known as the Via Sebaste, ran through Asia Minor and stops in Galatia and Pisidia, areas that are going to be very important for the missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul. As you know, Asia Minor is what we know of today as Turkey. Most of the roads through the area were made of gravel. Some of the major arteries would have had brick and mortar siding to protect the road, and there would have been stone posts serving every mile to indicate how far the distance was covered. On an average day, a traveler would have covered about 12 to 18 miles. So they were able to move fairly quickly on foot. Occasionally, there would have been horses or donkeys carrying goods, but the vast majority of the travel would have been on foot. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. You had to see that coming. There were ships of various sizes traveling between ports carrying cargo. In Paul's day, there weren't really any passenger ships, but there would be room for maybe as many as 600 or more people, sailors, traders, military troops, different people on board a ship. And so once the official purpose of a ship was fulfilled, other passengers could buy a spot or even work for a spot on board. They would hire themselves out in exchange for transport. It's possible that Paul did that maybe on some of the times he was on a ship he would have worked. Maybe he could have used his tent-making skills to help make sails. I don't know. That's pure conjecture. But what would happen is the ship would pull into a port. They would do whatever they were supposed to do if they were doing trade and they were supposed to load on goods, or if they were transporting military troops, they would get all of the troops counted and registered. They would see what room they had left, and they would let word go out and tell people that they had space. They would wait until the weather was good. It was a good time for them to set sail. Then they would send word out through the community that they were getting ready to go. Everybody would hurry back to the harbor and get on the ship, and then they would sail out. As they were sailing, they would stay as close to the harbor as possible, or as close to land as possible. They wouldn't just cut out across the open sea, but they would kind of trace the land from port to port for the entire trip. As they were traveling, whether it was by land or by sea, when they got to a port, or if they were walking, they would have been looking for places to stay. They would have been trying to find room at the inn. I don't know if you've ever seen the musical Les Mis, but the innkeeper in Les Mis is not that different from what a lot of the innkeepers would have been like in Paul's day. The inns were not secure, and the innkeepers were not always very trustworthy. One of the articles I looked at mentioned an event from the apocryphal book the Acts of St. John, in which he banished the bedbugs from his room, only to find them waiting at the door the next morning, asking permission to come back in. I don't know that that's true, but it is true that there would have been a lot of disease, a lot of bugs and rats, also a lot of robbery. And so, in general, travelers would have preferred to find people with whom they had a link to stay. Maybe not someone they knew, but someone of their same faith or someone of their same profession. We see that as we follow the trips of Paul, that he would be looking for God-fearers, or he would always go into the synagogue, and while he was there, he would have been asking, is there someone he could stay with? Or in other places, we see that he's meeting up with tent makers. That same policy is happening even today. If you go to the island of Penang in Malaysia, you'll see that each of the different Chinese temples has a marking that indicates what region of China they're from. And when someone comes from China to the island of Penang, the first thing they'll do is they'll go to the temple that represents their part of the country, and then they'll ask around if there's somebody they can stay with, if somebody could give them a job. So that same principle, that same way of working is what was familiar with Paul. And that's why we see stories of Paul and his companions staying with Lydia or tent makers, or as I say, going into the synagogue when they arrived into a new town. Now let's take a minute and consider some of the places that Paul went as he was traveling. The first place that he started is Antioch. Sometimes we call that Syrian Antioch, and we'll talk about that in a minute, why we say that. But Syrian Antioch is located about 300 miles north of Jerusalem. The city was planned by Alexander the Great and was established 300 years before the birth of Christ by Seleucus Nicator, the ruler of Syria. He founded and named a number of cities, as many as 16 of them in honor of his father, and that's why we say Syrian Antioch, because later on, even on this journey, they're going to go to Pisidian Antioch. The people there wouldn't have said that. They would have just said Antioch. But as we're trying to discuss and make a distinction, it's like if you live in Paris, Texas, you just say you live in Paris. But other people might say Paris, Texas, to distinguish it from Paris, France. Anyway, in the city of Antioch, there were a lot of people living there. During the Roman occupation, it became the capital of Syria, and maybe 500,000 people, as many as 500,000 people, called this bustling commercial city their home. The church at Antioch was one of the main congregations in the early days of Christianity. As we know, it was the place where followers of the Way were first called Christians. It was the first Gentile congregation, and as far as we know, it was the first church to take up an offering to support believers in another community, and the first church to send out missionaries. From Acts chapter 13, verse 1, we know that the church membership included strong prophets and teachers. From Antioch, the next place that they will go is Seleucia. When Barnabas, Saul, and John Mark are sent out on this first missionary journey from Antioch, they boarded a ship in the nearby port of Seleucia. It was about 16 miles away, and it was the main seaport in that area. From Seleucia, they're going to get on a ship that's going to take them to Cyprus. Cyprus is a fairly large island, about 60 miles wide and 140 miles long, in the Mediterranean Sea. In the Old Testament, it's known as Katam. It's actually my family's favorite vacation spot where we've ever been. It's just a beautiful island. Barnabas was from this island. It was a shipping lane crossroad between Turkey and Syria. While they were there, the missions team stopped in two cities. They stopped in Salamis, which is located on the eastern end of the isle and is the largest city in Cyprus at that time. And from there, they went across the island from east to west to the city of Paphos, which was the capital city of the island on the far end. From there, they're going to travel to Perga. Perga was the port city in southern Asia Minor, where ships from Paphos would dock, so going straight north. And Perga served as a gateway to the Gentile communities in Asia Minor. And then just a brief 100-mile journey overland, they walked up into Perga, from Perga into Antioch Pisidian, or Pisidian Antioch. That would have meant a lot of walking through a lot of dangerous countryside. From there, they're going to go to Iconium, which is 80 miles east of Antioch. Iconium was the capital city of the district of Laconia, a section within the province of Galatia. It was a great walled city. From there, they went to Lystra, another Roman colony in the district of Laconia, 18 miles south of Iconium. And then finally, they're going to go to Derbe, which is 60 miles southeast of Lystra, and the third city in Laconia where the team preached the gospel. So that's just a list of cities, but here's a map. These are the way these countries look today to give you an idea when we hear in the news about Syria and Lebanon and Israel, Turkey. Those countries in that form did not exist in Paul's day, but you can see here on the map where they started in Antioch and came from Antioch to Seleucia. And then from there they sailed to Salamis and then walked across to Paphos. From there they took the ship up to Perga, to Pisidian Antioch, over to Iconium, to Lystra, to Derbe. And then they just kind of retraced themselves back, came back to Antioch, and then eventually, we're going to look at next week, going down to Jerusalem to report to the church what happened. So that's the geographic outline of the first missionary journey. What we're going to do now is we're going to actually look at Scripture and see what the Bible tells us happened during that journey. And so here's your assignment for tomorrow. I want you to read Acts chapter 13 and Acts chapter 14. And for each place the team went, so you have that list that we just went through of all of the places that they went, I want you to answer the following questions. Who did the work? Where did they work? How long were they there? What were the results, including churches and believers, but also talking maybe if there was persecution or trouble or hardship? How did it come about? And why did they leave? You may want to create some kind of a chart or a spreadsheet. As we go through the second and third missionary journey, we're going to keep looking at these questions. We want to be looking for trends and also things that are unique, but we want to get a good picture of how the Apostle Paul and his ministry team worked. Did he work alone or did he always have somebody with him? Were there strategies that every place he went, he did everything differently, or were there strategies that were consistently seen? So that's what we're going to be looking for. So tomorrow I want you to read carefully in Acts chapter 13 and Acts chapter 14 and answer these questions. We'll come back in session 3 and see what we can learn from that. Enjoy your study. Ask the Holy Spirit to guide you, and I look forward to learning from you when we get back together again. Thank you. We don't really have any records of the food that Paul ate on his trips. We know that he no longer worried about kosher, so he might have wanted the ham, and this is a ciabatta roll, which is Italian, so he probably would have known about that. Maybe Titus introduced him to Dijon mustard, I don't know. But whatever he ate, I hope he enjoyed it. God bless.